introducing the idea of communism. My name is Sally Campbell. I work for Bookmarks Publications, and I'll be chairing the session. We've got three excellent speakers on the panel tonight. First of all, we've got Alex Kallinikos. He's a leading member of the London. He's also the author of lots of books, the most recent of which is Bonfire of Illusions, and there's also a new edition of his classic revolutionary ideas of Karl Marx. We also have John Holloway. He's professor at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities at the Autonomous University in Pueblo, Mexico. He's the author, probably most famously, of Change the World Without Taking Power, which has a new edition coming in September, and also his most recent book is Crap Capitalism. And finally we have Slawoj Zizek. Theoretical philosopher, author of dozens of books, and the latest is Living in the End Times. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers to put their case. While they're doing that, members of the team in the red t-shirts will be going around with speaker slips. So for the 1,000 people in this room who want to contribute or ask a question or put a point to any of our speakers, please take a slip, fill it in and hand it in. So after they've all introduced the topic, we'll open it up then to the discussion from the floor. So first of all, I'll introduce Alex Kallinikos.
Thanks very much. A couple of months ago, I was visiting South Africa, and I went to the Museum of Apartheid in Johannesburg, which is a fantastic record of the whole system of racial oppression in South Africa. And halfway through going round the museum, I burst into tears. And the reason why I did was because I realised that apartheid, this whole institutionalised system of oppression, had been reduced to items in a museum. For the first few decades of my life, I was brought up on the assumption that apartheid was part of the permanent furniture of the world. And suddenly, I was brought up with something that I'd known intellectually, but was experiencing emotionally, that apartheid, this dense system of oppression, had gone. Of course, that leaves many other evils in the world, but that particular form of oppression had gone, and it was a wonderful moment. Now, what I'd like to do one day, and it may be in a few decades' time, I'm rather bent and on a stick, is to go to a museum of capitalism. I want capitalism to be reduced to the same status as apartheid. But that poses the question, where would I be if I went to a museum of capitalism? And the answer is in communism, in a communist society. Now, because more than anything else, communism is the name of the alternative to capitalism. I want to say something about the classical Marxist understanding of communism, but it's an idea that has been returned, at least to intellectual debate, in the past few years, particularly as a result of the interventions by Slavoy over there and by the French philosopher Alain Badiou. And I think this is a very useful thing to have happened, because we're confronted with an extremely serious and I think protracted crisis of capitalism, and therefore we need to be talking not about regulating capitalism, not about reforming capitalism, but by replacing it with something completely different. And communism is about the alternative. The idea of communism is about the idea of the alternative to capitalism. So, what is communism? Now, Marx and Engels gave a classic definition of communism in the Communist Manifesto, and they said, for us, communism is the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. And I think that that's a very important idea there, that communism isn't, for Marx at least, primarily an idea. Communism is the actual revolutionary process that abolishes capitalism. And implied in that is a degree of scepticism about too much discussion of the idea of communism, as opposed to the development, as Marx and Engels put it, of real movements that can begin to destroy it as a system. But of course that isn't all that Marx says about communism. In Capital, he calls communism the rule of the associated producers. In other words, those who perform the labour, those who produce the wealth, collectively taking control of the productive resources of society. And in the critique of the Goethe programme, he talks about the kind of principle that would govern a communist society. And this, he says, would be the principle of from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs, which is, if you think about it, a radically egalitarian principle. You distribute on the basis of what people need, and you demand from people not what you're prepared to pay them, not, in other words, you don't get people to participate in production on the basis of material incentives, you get them to participate on the basis of what abilities they can bring to the whole process of producing things. Now, I don't think Marx's very limited discussions of communism are the end of the story by any means, apart from anything else, because of Marx's critique of utopian socialism, in other words, of constructing ideal schemes of a communist society. He says, I think, just too little about what a communist society would be like, and that's a discussion that we need to continue. But it seems to me that fundamentally, in those relatively brief intuitions that we find in Marx, we get the basis of a good understanding of communism. And it seems to me better than some of the things that have been put around in the current debates, like Badiou, in his writings on communism, vacillates between a very abstract notion of communism as essentially the ideal of equality, which seems to be much too abstract because it says nothing about how production is organised. Alternatively, he's much too concrete because he moves from talking about communism with a small c, the alternative to capitalism, to talking about communism with a capital C. In other words, actually existing communist parties who more often than not are Stalinist parties compromised by all sorts of very fundamental failings. And I think there are two things that are missing from Badiou's discussion. First of all, the critique of political economy, because when Marx talks about the real movement for the abolition of the present state of things, the soil from which that real movement grows, the grounding for any real movement towards communism is provided by capitalist society and its contradictions. And Badiou says nothing about that. Secondly, what's missing from Badiou's discussion of communism is self-emancipation. The self-emancipation of the working class that was central to Marx's conception of how society would be transformed. In other words, the achievement of communism is the act of the oppressed and the exploited themselves. No one else can do it for them. Now, turning to Slavoy and John, I think that they both certainly agree about the necessity of the critique of political economy. I'm sure that John agrees about self-emancipation, although I think we have different understandings of self-emancipation. I'd be interested to know what Slavoy thought about that, because it seems to be critical to any notion of a genuine communist transformation, or the actuality of a communist transformation. But I think there is a point on which we do disagree, and I want to spend the last time that I have. How much have I got left? 7 minutes. Good, that should be enough. Talking about something where I think we will disagree, which is that contemporary discussions of communism tend to focus on the idea of the commons, which is a very widespread idea on the radical left around the world. And very often people talk, so powerful is the idea of the commons, that people talk about communism as opposed to communism. Now, what's the idea here? The idea is that there's lots of good stuff in the world, either natural resources or human creativity and its fruits. And this good stuff is essentially, in some sense, collectively owned. And the problem is that capitalism comes along and pinches all this good stuff and turns it to its own purposes. And that's fundamentally not simply what's wrong with capitalism, but what drives capitalism. Now, of course, it's true that there is lots of good stuff in the world that is a product of collective action or is collectively appropriated in some sort of way, and it's absolutely true that capitalism is coming along all the time and pinching it. Marx talks about the primitive accumulation of capital, the original seizure of key productive resources that makes capitalism possible as a system. But John and David Harvey and other people have stressed that this appropriation of what's commonly owned is a continuing reality of capitalism. It's not just something that happened in the past, it's something that goes on all the time. But I think it's a mistake simply to reduce what capitalism does to that. And there are people who do that. I'm not saying that either Slavoy or John does, but for example, Hardta and Negri do. For example, in their most recent book, Commonwealth. And the effect of what they essentially do is reduce capitalism to the appropriation of the commons. And what that means is capitalism is essentially an external and parasitic force that comes along and seizes things and turns it to its own purposes. This, I think, is a profound misunderstanding of Marx, and more importantly, a profound misunderstanding of capitalism. Because for Marx, capital, he insists on this, is a social relation. And it's a social relation defined by, fundamentally, all sorts of other things, the exploitative relationship between capital and wage labour. And the relationship between capital and wage labour is an internal, it's an intrinsic one. Each of the parties to the relationship, the workers who are exploited and the capitalists who exploit them, are defined socially by the connection with each other. Why does it matter? I mean, this may sound like a weird bit of kind of philosophical abstraction that I'm engaging in. It matters because it helps us to understand what's happening in capitalism today. Let's look at China, the kind of fantasy world of the apologists of capitalism. If you look at what's happening in China today, of course it's true that commons have been appropriated, that in all sorts of ways the newly developing private capitalist class establishes itself as a social and economic force by grabbing collectively owned land, stealing all sorts of stuff and so on. But that's not what's critical to what's happening in China. What we see in China is a process of very rapid capitalist development that involves an enormous creation and expansion of human productive capabilities by bringing workers together in conditions where they're collectively exploited. There's this place called Foxconn, which is an extraordinary company which produces an awful lot of the iPads and iPods and iPhones and so on that everyone desires so much, which involves one complex in the southeast of China where 300,000 workers are employed in the same factory town. That's crucial to the kind of capitalist development that is taking place in China. And what it involves is a vast expansion in human productive capabilities, but on the basis of the most intensive exploitation. What this means is, and this is something that Marx is very insistent on, that communism isn't just about taking back what capital stole, what those collectively owned resources that pre-existed the formation of the capital relation. What communism, much more importantly, is about is seizing the productive capacities that are created within the framework of the capital relation. Marx has this marvellously contradictory view of capitalism as a disastrous and destructive force, but also an enormous expansion in human productive powers, which revolution is about taking control of. Why does this matter politically? It matters politically because ultimately it comes down to the question of power.